In the spring of 1861, along the dark waters of the Mississippi River near Natchez, a prosperous cotton plantation known as Blackwood Manor became the stage for one of the most disturbing family tragedies ever whispered about in the parlors of the Delta elite. Colonel Nathaniel Blackwood, a 72-year-old widower who had built his fortune on the backs of nearly 200 enslaved souls, was found dead in his study on the morning of April 14th, his body slumped over a desk covered with ledgers that documented decades of human suffering. The official cause: heart failure. The truth: a carefully orchestrated murder planned by his own daughter, a woman whose desperation to secure her inheritance would reveal the moral rot at the very heart of Southern aristocracy. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal what power, greed, and the institution of slavery could drive human beings to become. Blackwood Manor stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, its fields white with cotton, each autumn, its coffers heavy with gold derived from the labor of men, women, and children who would never see a penny of the wealth they created. The manor house itself stood as a monument to antebellum excess: 3 stories of white columns and wide verandas, crystal chandeliers imported from France, mahogany furniture from the Caribbean, and portraits of Blackwood ancestors who stared down from the walls with the cold certainty of their own superiority. Colonel Nathaniel Blackwood had inherited this empire from his own father in 1823, and had spent nearly 4 decades expanding it, acquiring more land, more slaves, more influence in a society that measured a man's worth by the number of human beings he owned. Colonel was known throughout Adams County as a stern but shrewd businessman, a man who attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday with his Bible under his arm, while his overseers wielded whips in the fields 6 days a week. He had been widowed for 15 years, his wife Margaret having died in childbirth, with their 3rd child, a boy who survived only 3 days. This left him with 2 daughters, Catherine, born in 1825, and the younger Eleanor, born in 1829. Catherine, the elder, had married a Charleston merchant in 1844 and moved to South Carolina, effectively removing herself from the daily life of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor, however, remained unmarried at 32, a situation that caused considerable scandal in a society where a woman's value was determined by her ability to secure a proper marriage and produce legitimate heirs. Eleanor Blackwood was a woman of a striking appearance rather than conventional beauty. Tall and angular, with dark hair she wore pulled severely back from a high forehead, she possessed her father's sharp intelligence and his capacity for calculation. She had been educated at a finishing school in New Orleans, where she had learned French music and the elaborate social codes that governed the lives of plantation mistress. But she had also inherited something else from her father, an absolute conviction that the world owed her everything, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. By 1861, as war clouds gathered over the South and the future of the plantation system itself seemed uncertain, Eleanor had grown increasingly desperate. Her father, despite his age, showed no signs of dying naturally, and worse, he had recently begun, speaking of changing, his will to leave the entire plantation to Catherine's son, his grandson, who bore the Blackwood name, rather than to Eleanor, who he increasingly saw as an embarrassment and a burden. The enslaved population of Blackwood Manor lived in 2 rows of whitewashed cabins behind the main house, far enough to be out of sight during social gatherings, but close enough that their labor was always immediately available. Among these 200 souls, several would become unwitting participants in Eleanor's scheme. There was Moses, 45 years old, the head carpenter, who had been born on the plantation and whose skill with wood and tools had earned him a small measure of autonomy that was rare among the enslaved. His son, Samuel, 22, worked as the colonel's personal valet, one of the few enslaved men allowed inside the manor house regularly. There was also Delilah, 38, who served as the head cook, a woman whose knowledge of herbs and roots extended beyond the culinary, knowledge passed down from her mother, who had been brought from Haiti decades before. Her daughter, Celia, 19, worked as Eleanor's lady's maid, sleeping on a pallet at the foot of Eleanor's bed, privy to conversations and confidences that no enslaved person should ever have been forced to hear. Then there was Jacob, 51, the head field driver, who enforced the work rhythms in the cotton fields, a man hardened by the impossible position of being both victim and enforcer of the system. His wife, Hannah, 47, worked in the manor house doing laundry and mending. Completing the score group were 2 younger men, Thomas, 24, who worked in the stables, and Benjamin, 26, a field hand whose intelligence had never been allowed any outlet beyond the cotton rows. The crisis that would set everything in motion came in late February of 1861, just weeks after Mississippi had seceded from the Union. Colonel Blackwood summoned Eleanor to his study and informed her of his decision. He had consulted with his lawyer in Natchez. He told her, and they intended to revise his will. The plantation, with all its land, slaves, and assets, would pass to Catherine's son, William, who was then 16 years old. Eleanor would receive a modest allowance, the furniture from her mother's room, and the right to continue living in one of the smaller houses on the property, provided she remained unmarried and conducted herself appropriately. As for Eleanor herself, the colonel said with barely concealed contempt, she had failed in the primary duty of a woman of her station. She had not secured a husband, had not produced heirs, had not fulfilled the role that Southern society demanded of its daughters. She was, in his words, a disappointment and a drain on the family name. Eleanor sat in the chair across from her father's desk, her hands folded in her lap, with perfect composure, her face revealing nothing of the rage and desperation that churned within her. She asked calmly when he intended to make these changes official. Soon, he replied. Perhaps within the month, as soon as the lawyer could prepare the proper documents. She nodded, thanked him for his time, and excused herself. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom on the second floor, her mind was already racing through possibilities, scenarios, desperate calculations. She had been raised in this house, had spent her entire life watching its operations, understanding its rhythms, knowing where power resided and how it flowed, and she understood something else in a world built on slavery, where human beings were property and violence was the foundation of the social order. There were always methods available to those willing to use them, always people who could be compelled or manipulated into actions they would never choose freely. Pause for a moment and consider this. In a society where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where families were torn apart for profit, where violence was so normalized, it barely drew comment. Is it any wonder that such a system would corrupt even those it privileged? Eleanor Blackwood was about to demonstrate that slavery destroyed not only those it enslaved, but also those who believed themselves its beneficiaries, turning them into moral monsters capable of unspeakable acts. Over the next 6 weeks, Eleanor began to lay her groundwork with a patience and calculation that would have impressed her father had he known of it. She started spending more time in the quarters, bringing small gifts of fabric and tobacco, things she had never done before, but which now served to create a sense of obligation and confusion. She paid particular attention to Delilah, the cook, engaging her in conversations about herbs and remedies, asking about treatments for various ailments, displaying an interest that seemed maternal and keen, but was anything but. She also began meeting privately with Celia, her lady's maid, in ways that went beyond their usual interactions. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Eleanor would confide in the young woman, speaking of her fears, her desperation, the injustice of her father's decision. She wept genuine tears of frustration and rage, and Celia, who had been trained since childhood to comfort and serve this white woman, found herself drawn into an emotional intimacy that crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed in that time and place. The plan that eventually emerged was both simple and terrible. Colonel Blackwood suffered from occasional heart palpitations, a condition that his physician in Natchez had warned could prove fatal. It took a nightly tonic, prepared by Delilah, that was meant to calm his heart and help him sleep. Eleanor had learned, through her careful questioning, that certain plants and roots, when prepared correctly, could slow the heart to the point of stopping it entirely, mimicking the appearance of natural heart failure in an elderly man already known to have heart problems. The death would be attributed to his age and condition. No one would question it. No one would investigate. And Eleanor would infediate. And Eleanor would inherit everything as the only daughter still living in Mississippi before the new will could be drafted and signed. She needed Delilah to prepare the poison and deliver it in the nightly tonic. She needed Samuel, the colonel's valet, to ensure the tonic reached his master and that no one else witnessed its delivery. She needed Celia to remain silent about the conversations and to provide an alibi if needed, and to ensure their cooperation. Eleanor used the only tools she had, fear and false promises. She told them that if they helped her, she would grant them their freedom once she inherited the plantation. She would give Moses and his family papers of manumission, would allow Delilah and Celia to go north, would provide Thomas and Benjamin with money to start new lives. These were lies, of course, elaborate and cruel lies, but they were also the only hope any of these people had ever been offered, and in the desperate calculations of enslaved people, weighing the certain horror of their present against the slim possibility of freedom, some chose to believe. Delilah resisted at first. In the kitchen house, away from the main manor, Eleanor found her one evening, and spoke to her with a directness that was chilling in its honesty. If Delilah refused, Eleanor said calmly, she would tell the colonel that Delilah had attempted to poison him anyway. Who would believe an enslaved woman's word against that of a white lady? Delilah would be hung, and her daughter would be sold downriver to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the mortality rate was so high that it amounted to a death sentence. But if Delilah cooperated, Eleanor continued, if she helped make this happen, then freedom awaited. Not just for her, but for Celia too. They could go north to Philadelphia, where there were free black communities, where Celia could marry a free man and have children who would never know chains. It was a devil's bargain, an impossible choice, But it was also the reality of slavery, impossible choices, where every option led to damnation, but some forms of damnation at least held the distant possibility of salvation. Consider this moment, this terrible moment, when a mother is forced to choose between participating in murder or watching her daughter be sold into certain death. This was the machinery of slavery, the way it turned human beings into accomplices in their own degradation, forcing them into positions where morality itself became a luxury they could not afford. Eleanor Blackwood understood this machinery perfectly, and she wielded it without hesitation or remorse. The actual preparation took place over several nights in mid-March. Delilah, using knowledge that had been passed down through generations, prepared a compound from foxglove, oleander, and other plants that grew in the woods and gardens around the plantation. The dosage was critical. Too much would cause violent symptoms that would raise suspicion. Too little would fail to achieve the desired effect. She tested it on one of the plantation's hunting dogs, a creature that died in its sleep, with no outward signs of distress. Samuel, the valet, was brought into the conspiracy through a combination of threats and promises similar to those used on Delilah. Moses, his father, knew nothing of the plan, which was intentional. Samuel wanted to protect his father from knowledge that could get him killed. Each night, Samuel would bring the colonel his evening tonic on a silver tray, the drink prepared by Delilah, with the poison carefully measured and mixed in. But Eleanor told them to wait, to establish the routine, to make sure everything was perfect before the final act. During this time, Eleanor maintained her usual routines with remarkable composure. She attended church services, where she sat in the Blackwood family pew, sang hymns about Christian charity and divine grace. She took tea with neighbors, engaged in polite conversation about the war that was surely coming, about whether their slaves would remain loyal, about the righteousness of their cause. She played the piano in the evening while her father sat reading his newspaper, and she showed him nothing but daughterly respect and affection. At night, alone in her room with only Celia sleeping at the foot of her bed, she sometimes allowed herself to imagine the future, herself as mistress of Blackwood Manor, free to make her own decisions, to command respect, to finally have the power that she believed should have been hers by right of birth. The fact that this future would be built on her father's murder seemed not to trouble her at all, or if it did, she had become so adept at suppressing such feelings that they might as well not have existed. If you're finding this account as disturbing as it should be, subscribe to Shadows of the South for more forgotten stories that reveal the true moral cost of the slave-holding South, narratives that have been buried but deserve to be remembered and examined. The night chosen for the final acts was April 13th, 1861, a Saturday evening. The colonel had spent the day reviewing his account books and writing letters to his overseer about the spring planting. He dined alone, as was his custom, since Eleanor usually took her meals in her room, claiming headaches or fatigue. At 9 o'clock, Samuel brought him his evening tonic as usual. The colonel drank it without comment, as he had done every night for years. Samuel left the study and went directly to his cabin, where he lay awake all night, unable to sleep, waiting for the alarm that would surely come with morning. Delilah, in her own cabin, knelt on the floor and prayed for forgiveness, though she did not believe forgiveness was possible for what she had done. Eleanor, in her bedroom, dismissed Celia early and sat in a chair by the window, watching the stars, feeling nothing that she would later be able to name or describe. The colonel was discovered by Samuel at 6 o'clock the next morning when he entered the study to wake his master for Sunday services. Nathaniel Blackwood was slumped in his chair, his head resting on his desk, one hand still holding a pen, as though he had simply fallen asleep while working. But his skin was cold and his heart was still. Samuel raised the alarm, his shouts bringing the household staff running. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown and wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face a perfect mask of shock and grief. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, and entered her father's study. She stood looking at his body for a long moment. Then she knelt beside his chair and took his cold hand in hers. Her tears, when they came, were genuine, though whether they were tears of grief, relief, or something more complicated, perhaps even she could not have said. The local physician, Dr. Harrison, was summoned from Natchez. He arrived that afternoon and conducted a brief examination. Given the colonel's age and known heart condition, Dr. Harrison saw no reason to suspect anything other than natural causes. He signed the death certificate without hesitation: heart failure, sudden but not unexpected in a man of 72 years. The funeral was held 3 days later at First Presbyterian Church, attended by every prominent family in Adams County. Eleanor, dressed in deep mourning, received their condolences with appropriate dignity. Her sister Catherine sent a telegram from Charleston expressing her grief and announcing that she would not be able to attend due to the difficulties of travel in these uncertain times. The colonel was buried in the family plot behind the church, beneath a marble stone that proclaimed him a devoted father, a faithful Christian, and a pillar of the community. The reading of the will took place a week later in the library of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed as the lawyer from Natchez opened the document. It was the old will, dated 1854, not the revised version that the colonel had planned but never completed. According to its terms, the entire plantation, with all its land, property, and enslaved people, would pass to Eleanor Catherine Blackwood as the only daughter residing in Mississippi. Catherine, in Charleston, would receive a monetary bequest of $5,000. The lawyer looked up from the document and met Eleanor's eyes. She nodded once, as though this was exactly what she had expected, nothing more and nothing less than a rightful inheritance. The lawyer left within the hour. Eleanor remained in the library, surrounded by her father's books, looking out the window at the cotton fields that now belonged to her. Stop and reflect on what has just occurred. A daughter has murdered her own father, not in a moment of passion or rage, but through careful planning and cold calculation. She has manipulated enslaved people, using their desperate hope for freedom as a tool to accomplish her crime. She has corrupted the bonds of family, violated every Christian principle she claimed to hold sacred, all for the sake of property and wealth, built on the suffering of others, and the system of slavery itself made this possible, provided both the means and the moral framework that allowed such monstrosities to occur. But if Eleanor believed her troubles were over, she was mistaken. The enslaved community at Blackwood Manor knew something was wrong. Moses, Samuel's father, questioned his son about what had happened, and eventually the truth emerged. The horror and moral weight of what they had been forced to participate in began to spread through the quarters, like a sickness. Delilah stopped sleeping entirely, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking as she worked in the kitchen. Celia wept constantly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Samuel became silent and withdrawn, his usual composure cracking under the weight of guilt and fear. And Eleanor, who had promised them freedom, showed no signs of fulfilling those promises. Days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. The spring planting continued. The overseer's whip still cracked in the fields, and the enslaved people of Blackwood Manor remained in bondage. Hannah, Jacob's wife, who worked in the manor house, began to notice things. The way Eleanor watched Samuel and Celia with barely concealed tension. The way Delilah flinched whenever Eleanor entered the kitchen house. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone else approached. Hannah was an observant woman who had survived decades of slavery by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, by understanding the currents of power and danger that flowed through plantation life. She spoke quietly with her husband Jacob, who in turn spoke with Moses. So slowly, carefully, they began to piece together what had happened. But what could they do with such knowledge? To accuse a white woman of murder, to suggest that the colonel had been poisoned, would be to sign their own death warrants. In the slave-holding South, the word of enslaved people meant nothing against the word of white people, and any accusation would be turned back on them with lethal force. Yet guilt and fear have a way of manifesting in ways that cannot be entirely controlled. Samuel began drinking stolen whiskey, trying to numb the horror of what he had done. One night in early May, drunk and despairing in the cabin, he shared with other unmarried men, he spoke too loudly about freedom that had been promised, but never delivered, about a devil's bargain and blood on his hands. Another enslaved man, frightened by what he was hearing and hoping to protect himself from association with whatever Samuel was involved in, reported the conversation to the overseer, a brutal man named Jennings, who had served the Blackwoods for 20 years. Jennings brought the information to Eleanor. Eleanor's response was swift and merciless. She could not risk Samuel's knowledge becoming public, could not risk that his drunken ravings might be taken seriously by someone. She told Jennings that Samuel had been stealing from the manor house, that she had evidence of his theft, and that he should be sold immediately to a slave trader heading to the cotton fields of Texas, as far from Mississippi as possible. This was a death sentence of a different kind. The Texas cotton frontier was a place where enslaved people were worked to death with brutal efficiency, where survival measured in months rather than years. Moses, Samuel's father, begged Eleanor to reconsider, prostrating himself before her in a display of humiliation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But Eleanor was unmoved. Samuel sold within 3 days, chained to a coffle of other enslaved people being marched west, and Moses never saw his son again. This act of betrayal sent a clear message to Delilah and Celia. The promises of freedom had been lies, and anyone who spoke of what had happened would meet a similar or worse fate. Delilah withdrew into herself, speaking only when necessary, her knowledge of herbs and plants no a burden too terrible to bear. Celia continued to serve as Eleanor's maid, but something fundamental had broken inside her. She moved through her duties like an automaton, her spirit crushed under the weight of what she had been forced to participate in and the realization that there would never be any escape, never any redemption. Meanwhile, Eleanor took control of Blackwood Manor with ruthless efficiency. She proved herself every bit as shrewd a manager as her father had been, perhaps more so. She hired a new overseer, replaced some of the older enslaved field workers with younger, stronger men purchased at auction in Natchez, and implemented new accounting methods that maximized productivity and profit. She entertained neighbors, joined the local ladies' auxiliary that was organizing aid for Confederate soldiers, and established herself as a respectable widow of the planter class, managing her inheritance with competence and dignity. To the white society of Adams County, she was an admirable woman, shouldering burdens that might have overwhelmed someone less capable, maintaining the plantation and upholding the values of the South, even as war raged around them. What remains is not just a story of individual evil, but a window into the deeper pathology of the slave-holding South. Eleanor Blackwood was not unique in her capacity for cruelty, or her willingness to use enslaved people as tools for her own purposes. These were common features of plantation society, woven into its daily operations and moral fabric. What made her case remarkable was only the specific nature of her crime, patricide, but the underlying dynamics, the way that slavery corrupted all human relationships, turned children against parents, forced enslaved people into impossible moral compromises, and normalized violence and deception as everyday tools of social control. These were universal features of the system. Eleanor destroyed herself and everyone around her, not despite the system of slavery, but because of it, through mechanisms that the system had created and sustained for generations. The colonel's death, Eleanor's plot, Delilah's anguished cooperation, Samuel's drunken confession, and the brutal retribution that followed, all of it reveals the central truth about slavery that many in the South tried desperately to hide. It was not a paternalistic system of mutual obligation and care, as its defenders claimed. It was a regime of terror and exploitation that destroyed souls as surely as it destroyed bodies, that turned human beings into monsters or forced them into monstrous acts, that created a world where murder, betrayal, and cruelty were not aberrations but logical outcomes of the system's fundamental premises. Eleanor Blackwood's story is a Southern Gothic tragedy, not because it is exceptional, but because it so perfectly encapsulates the moral horror at the heart of the slave-holding South. The way that the institution of slavery poisoned everything it touched, leaving only ruins, grief, and unanswerable questions about how supposedly civilized people could have created and sustained such a system for so long. These stories reveal the profound moral cost of power built on the backs of enslaved human beings, and they remind us that the South's attempt to forget or romanticize this history serves only to compound the original crime. If this account has troubled you, as it should, share your reflections in the comments below, and consider what legacies of this dark period still persist in our own time. The past is never truly past, and only by confronting these stories honestly can we begin to understand the world we have inherited.